Hello and welcome to the WorldCraft Club, a show for writers who want to create rich, immersive settings for their audience to come back to time and time again. I'm your host, James, and today we have a very special episode where we're going to be diving into the question, why can we just not shut up about world building? I think we're like 80 episodes deep in that, and I've invited some guests who are just as passionate about it as we are. So first we have for Shady. How you doing, Shady?
Yo, what's up?
Yo. And H.Y. Geiger. Sorry,
Geiger.
I keep wanting to call. I keep wanting to name you after the person that designed the aliens.
Yeah.
It's
HR,
sorry, I'm a big fan
right?
of that series. That's
HR
H.R. Geiger. Yeah. So H.Y. Gregor. I apologize.
No worries. I'm Hailey. Hi.
I mean, it sounds right. It's true. But anyway, Hailey and Shady join us from the World Asunder podcast as part of the Book Career Network, and of course we have season regular Seth Ring with us today. How you doing, Seth?
What's up?
I think we've been in our first season since we started. I don't think we ever
Have we just not skipped
do it when we can.
to the second one? We should do that at some point.
We never did that. We should just officially announce season 2.
Season 2, starting today.
Yeah. Yes.
It's not.
The next
This
episode.
is still
This
season
is
one.
the finale of
Next.
season 1.
Yeah.
4 years of season 1. Here you are.
We don't make concise statements. We need 20 hours of my voice on the internet before we're done. All right. So why can't we shut up about world building? I think this inevitably, I was actually thinking about this as I was driving because Seth had posed the question. And I think the phrase from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came to my mind. The spaceship floated in the air the way bricks don't. Was one of the most just abundantly clear statements of what I was looking at in a story that kind of made me go, oh, because The Hitchhiker's Guide is actually very unsettling, and it is genuine science fiction. It's sort of a bit of parody. It's got a lot of stuff going on in there, but that was a world that was broadly expansive and honestly got me thinking a lot about where this world could go, and albeit very silly, but that's also the reason I love the Dune movies, is because all the ships float like bricks don't. They're all at jaunty angles, and it's very weird sci-fi, and I'm like, yes, jaunty angles, get rid of the thrusters, I want inexplicable anti-gravity. But that's just me. How about y'all? World building, why are you obsessed?
Well, so we touch on Douglas Adams a little bit because we one of the things that he stated outside of a book was when you have technology that is so inexplicable to or doesn't cover enough ground essentially that you can understand it, it's essentially magic, right? He has that
Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh, that was Arthur C.
sorry.
Clarke. No, that's my bad. I'm an idiot sometimes. That's why Hailey's my co-host, is to keep track of things for me.
No, my job is to take
one of the
notes.
things
Same deal for Seth.
you did bring back, you did bring one of my favorite lines out of Hitchhiker's Guide is, the whale is falling, has this whole self-identity crisis, and then figures out what it is, and then dies, and then the flower pot is just, oh no, not again, right? Where do you come up with that? Where do we come up with a scene like that? And part of it is, it's actually a quote that we put in our closer for Worlds Asunder, came from Futurama during Bender's God episode, where he goes, especially for us as because I kind of look at it more from the professional lens, not as much from the personal lens anymore, but it's. You want to do just enough that nobody knows you've done anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's where world building fascinates me, is where is that line? Where do we go? How do I get a scene like that flower pot and whale scene? How do I get there? And then you got to know that there is sometimes, we just think of the scene itself and we go, we'll solve the details later. And sometimes you have a whole backstory behind that you're going to explain later. And then you end up with that scene and then nice little, that hook, right? That's how you hook that reader, or how you hook, if you're DMing D&D adventures, you're hooking your players in, and that's to me, that's the magic.
Nice. Hailey, what you got?
I think for me, it goes back to when I was that nerdy little kid, reading under the covers at night, and my mom would come in and yell at me and take the flashlight away. Books were always safe, and they were always a place that I knew that if I was having a bad day or, if I was bored or whatever else, I could always go and there was always a good book. And for me, the foundation of creating worlds that people can really dig into, or the reason that books are comforting to so many people or that we enjoy the movies that we do, is because of the world building. That is where it starts. Because if you can create something immersive, then you want to have a good storyline, you want to have good characters, but it's where you can create settings like Rivendell that you can really sink yourself into, and then it provides like the perfect backdrop for the stories that you're wanting to tell. I usually start with that in my writing, which is not the convention that's super popular these days. So,
I like that though. That's expansive. That could go places. Seth, what you got?
I think for me, it's really exploration. I was very fortunate growing up to travel a lot, and the question of what's around the corner or what's over the horizon has just always been one that has resonated in my soul. And like Hailey, I've spent a lot of time as a kid in books because they were a very safe place, and they allowed me to sort of step outside of my circumstance, my immediate surroundings. And so learning to explore new worlds through stories, but then also matching that up to, again, this travel experience and really understanding that, just like in these books, I can go to a new place or a new world. There are things around the corner here. There are horizons that I can't see beyond, and I wonder what's over there. And the mix of that, just creating this idea in the back of my mind that's never gone away, that, it looks like it's just a forest, but there might be a gnome inside there. Like, there might be something creeping around, a fairy flying, when I turn my head away, right, what's there? And I think that has really, that's really hooked me. But, I have to say, I really resonate with this idea of being fascinated by the craft of it, by being fascinated by, like, how do you actually put something together that evokes that feeling? We, James, we talk a lot about visitants and about core concept and about the feeling or the conceptual piece of a story, what we want to invoke in our reader, our visitant. And I think that both of these ideas of exploration and technical craft lean toward that very thing. Trying to give a reader something, or give a viewer something, or find a feeling ourselves.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like humans really like narratives, and I think it's why conspiracy theories are so popular. There can't be just no reason that something happened. There has to be a reason, so there has to be some sort of nefarious force behind it, and people will make stories for whatever. One of the things that I've been fascinated by is inexplicable signs. So if you get a sign that says "Don't poop here," there's a story. You know what I mean? Like, that sign didn't just go there for no reason, and you look at it and you go, someone pooped here at one time. And then you start imagining why. And, like, you start looking around and you start piecing things together. And, like, that's a really, really, like, maybe very silly and reductive way to think about it. But, like, I feel like that's what a lot of world building is to me, is sort of like signaling that there could be a lot more going on here, but never actually, like, telling me. I think half the problem I've got with a lot of modern media right now is just the quantity of it. I almost want them to just leave some stuff untold. Like, not everything needs an origin story for me. Sometimes I like to be like, it's a weird guy. Wonder how he got there. And just be like, I want to think about that. That the joy for me was in thinking about it. I don't know if you guys saw Arcane season 2, but, like, this whole thing of, like, there's this line in it that says, perfection did not lead to happiness, only the end of pursuit. And finishing all the stories that are out there, doesn't really make us happier, because the speculation's gone, and from the speculation came the joy. But the joy makes us go, what's around the corner? George Lucas, tell us, where did Anakin come from? We need to know. And it's like, but did we? Did we need that knowledge? Or could we have just speculated forever? And that's kind of like, that's what I think really drives me about it, and kind of what's sort of exhausting me a little bit. Like, I think I was dicking around with this definition of world building the other day, and I just kind of pitched it at Seth, but I was like, I think world building is effectively a tapestry of incomplete stories. Like, that's what I think it amounts to some degree. Things that are never satisfyingly resolved, but people can see it just along that horizon and kind of make guesses as to what's there without necessarily being revealed completely in the story in any way that's satisfying. But I'm not sure about that, and I'm open to pushback.
You made an interesting point, though. Conspiracy theories, in trying to explain things, right? That really, if we go back, even just a couple centuries, mythos, and we have our folk tales, we have fairy tales. We have used stories for a while to try and build out our own world. Right? True or false, however you believe, it's not. But like the Romans and the Greeks all attributed different things to different gods, right? That was their way of explaining the world around them. They were literally world building to try and understand what was going on. And then, science in and of itself, we pursue answers with science, but there's a reason why, like, science fiction has such a decent audience, and why it's stood the test of time as a genre. And it's because we can't answer everything. We can answer some things, and then we continue to build out the world around that with hypotheses, and sometimes they're untestable, sometimes they're, we find answers eventually. Sometimes the technology catches up. But
so this leads to a really interesting question. Do you think that science has negatively impacted our ability to tell fantastical stories? Has it added a requirement to world building that didn't exist when nothing was explained?
Not at all. In my opinion, it hasn't ruined that ability at all. In fact, it's given us more tools, right? If we just think about the different 80s sci-fi literature that took place in what is now the present, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine they imagine so many things for us, and I'm still waiting on a flying hoverboard. Right?
It's coming.
Right? It could be.
So do you think, though, that, or I guess to refine my question a little bit, because I think you're right. I think that knowing more hasn't necessarily impacted our ability to have expansive imagination. In a sense, it's enabled it. But do you think that it has fundamentally changed the way... I shouldn't... Sorry, let me phrase this properly. Has it fundamentally changed what we need in order to pass the sniff test, in order to have a story, have plausible deniability? Or not, that's wrong.
Plausibility?
Plausibility is absolutely what I meant.
I always can use more plausible deniability.
Yeah, me too. It's been on top of my mind recently.
No follow-up questions.
No follow-up. I want to know plausible deniability. Thanks. Okay. Hailey, what do you think?
I think for some things, yes. Especially for people that are writing or creating worlds that are urban or real-world settings. I think culturally, people are probably more closed-minded because it's really easy to be able to point to different, scientific advancements and think we have solved the mysteries of the universe. Therefore, why would we keep asking questions? I think that is something that's probably more common than it was, centuries ago. Because the biggest things, like, we understand gravity now. We know why the sun goes across the sky. We don't have to speculate about those kinds of things anymore. one of my favorite books that I read when I was a kid was about this cult that was essentially trying to bring back these like Cthulhu-esque kind of gods, because they said we had science and science destroyed our ability or our need to look to something, and then we became unruly. And so they were like, we need to bring these gods back to like restore, basically like rule, but also like give people something better to believe in, which was a concept that I thought was really fascinating. I don't know if I should name the book because that's like the big spoiler thing at the end.
Spoiler alert for a book we haven't named.
Yeah, sorry. But it's The Haunting of Elizabeth Cray by Chris Wooding, and it's a YA,
Gotcha.
kind of a steampunk novel, but it's alt history. So I would really recommend that one to anyone. But yeah, so I think that it has changed some things. But if I primarily write fantasy, and so I don't have to worry about being as plausible because I can, I can cut the tape, kind of.
Yeah.
I think there is. I think in some ways it's not even like technology or science, but the expectation of explainability.
Yeah.
Like there's this idea like that. It could be explained. Like if we dug deep enough. Like and I think there's this expectation of rules that would meaningfully apply to things. Like when I read Lord of the Rings, it's kind of like, well, how did Gandalf come back to life? What did he have to do that? Did he just get enough XP to make it happen when he killed the Balrog? And it's just like, people, they want rules, but it wasn't like, I just came back to finish my job. Like, that's really what happened, is he got sent back to finish the job. And, like, he's limited, but sometimes he does really powerful things, but that's because he has this role to play in Middle-earth. And, like, we're less amenable to those explanations. And, like, I could probably, with a brief search, find you 100 people on YouTube explaining the implausibility of the Hobbit's mailing system and the idea that you'd have that much literacy among a completely agrarian society that's openly xenophobic. But, like, we're not like, you know what I mean? It's like there's this, one of the words that we came to really like use, and Seth threw out a bunch of like sort of terms that we throw around a lot. So visitant was our like fancy word for somebody who's in a world. It was basically our medium agnostic term. So you're a reader, you're a player, whatever. You are a visitant into a world. And then this idea, we originally actually called it fairy cake because of Douglas Adams, the infinite perspective vortex. And we had this idea that at the middle of the perspective vortex was a piece of fairy cake from which they extrapolated the atoms from everything else. And so we got this idea that, like, you have this thing in the middle of your world where it's like, what would it be like if bears were even more dangerous? And, like, that's the world you create. And so, like, then that sort of is what you expand upon. It reminds me a little bit of like what you're talking about, Hailey, with like your concept where you're like, hey, I've got this thing I kind of want to write about, and you're almost like building your world before you're writing your story. And to me, that adds up. That makes a lot of sense, especially with like fantasy and science fiction. Like the Mistborn series would be a good example of like a fantasy that's like, they really lay down some hard rules, like this is how the magic works, and then you compare that to something more mystical. Tolkien springs to mind, but then even comparing Dune as science fiction to other science fiction properties, like you compare it to The Expanse, very different vibes. Again, brick spaceships that float at weird angles. That was the first, when I saw that thing, is Paul's walking along the beach and there's just a ship at like a weird angle with like no thrusters. I'm like, yes, make it come out of the water. So like that just scratched the itch for me. Weird sci-fi crap. I just love it. But even our science fiction has, to some degree, I think the expectation is less fictiony and more science-y, for it to some degree. I don't know if that trend's universal at all. And like, I also have tons of sympathy for Shady's point, like with the whole thing of like, no, actually we're learning so much weird crap about the universe right now that it's like, if anything, like it just gets weirder, you know what I mean? And like I like that too. I like kind of marrying those concepts.
Okay,
go for it, Seth.
So
see you
now I'm wondering, are we seeing a trend where sci-fi is getting weirder because we're learning so much about the universe and the world that when you actually pay attention, it just everything we learn opens up a million new questions, right? And in a sense, superheroes were this sort of this weirding of the world, where you're like, well, what if people had these powers, and what if they have, and then everybody gets one or a couple, and then there are just lots of them, and there are all sorts of different kinds of powers, and like every weird power that you can think of can exist in this space. And I wonder if science fiction is getting weirder because we feel like the world is getting weirder, and fantasy is getting less weird. It is getting more stable. It is getting more grounded. I don't know.
I think you can blame... I have a short. I think you can blame Brandon Sanderson for the science or fantasy becoming less weird, primarily because of Mistborn and a lot of his... So I haven't read a ton of his stuff, but I have read the Mistborn trilogy. And that book occasionally felt like I was reading an encyclopedia. It was so... that had such hard magic, as they call it, right? Like there were points where he was mixing different metals, and I didn't remember what they meant, and I had to flip to the back of the book to remind myself. And I think that was one of the first kind of hard magic series that became really popular. And I think that is now trending pretty intensely.
That's a good point. That's a good point. He really started a movement with that distinction of his understanding of hard and soft magic systems, and has really sort of infected the world to an extent.
That is a word, yes.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking especially, you do game lit, right? So it's like your worlds have to have rules that players can exploit to some degree. All right.
No,
fine.
But I understand what you're saying.
No.
All of my worlds have to have rules.
Yeah.
But they don't have to be explained. And I think one of the things that separates what you would call crunchy lit RPG from not crunchy lit RPG is this idea that there's either math involved or there's no math involved. They just leave the math out. And all of my stories leave the math out, right? And
you're playing Savage Worlds.
Yeah, essentially. It's very like, I write very soft systems. I don't write hard systems, mainly because I'm just not smart enough to like do that. I just can't keep track of it.
That's a lot of work, and I'm not sure the payoff is...
That's sort of where I landed.
You know?
And again, this comes back... So this goes to Shady's earlier thoughts about sort of the craft of world building being a fascinating thing, and like and pursuit of mastery when it comes to the tools that create good worlds. And I think that's a really interesting thing to explore. Just because whether we're talking about hard systems or whether we're talking about soft systems, whether we're talking about fantasy, whether we're talking about science fiction, all of these different types of world building, kinds of world building, flavors of world building come down to a lot of the same tools, right? Understanding narrative, understanding immersion, understanding how to, hook somebody. Understanding what to say and what not to say. So, and I hope I'm not throwing the conversation in too different of a direction, but I'd actually really love to get both of your takes on how do you pursue getting better at world building? Because this is a question I've been asking myself a lot.
For me, it's kind of the same thing that I do to just reset my muse in general, which is I will consume content, right? I either read, I watch TVs, movies, I listen to podcasts, I play video games. I currently both DM a D&D group and also play in a different TTRPG group. And all of that just like when I'm looking for an answer to something or I need inspiration somewhere, like for me that's how I kind of reset my mind.
Do you, if I can ask a follow-up question here, do you intentionally like pause when you see something you like and say and think about, okay, how did they do that? Or is it more of a passive absorption of sort of all the things and then using that to filter out what you want to do yourself?
It depends. Certain things I will, like, I'll go, all right, that was a really cool thing. Now I got to figure out how they came up with it. Like, I went through the entirety of the game Hogwarts Legacy. And it wasn't until I was doing something. I write a little bit for Gaxworks, and do some of their adventures that Luke Gygax puts out for D&D. And I was trying to think of something, and one of the things in the first one that I did for them, I had just finished up Hogwarts Legacy, and I thought back through it, and I went, that was a really cool kind of like interruption idea. Now I'm going to think about it and come back to it and go, all right, that would be really cool to include in this.
Yeah. Like looking for tools and then finding a place to slot them in.
Yeah. And then making it fit.
Yeah.
You guys kind of brought up, I'm going to touch back on a point you made a little bit ago, about science fiction getting weirder, but one of the things about world building for science fiction, right, is that we brought up Dune enough times. It is very focused on the characters. Yeah, right. I can keep going. It's very focused on the characters reacting to the world around them, right? If we switch POVs just slightly, or if we change up just one of the things about like any one of the characters or one of the events that occurs in the first book, we have an entirely different story. Right? And Dune as you know it changes because of that. And that's one of the things that to me, or like even if you just switch POVs, you switch how you write it. Hailey and I were both lucky enough to get invited to write in a space opera that is very character heavy, right? She talked a little bit about how she would write worlds out, and that's kind of how like Frank Herbert, J.R.R. Tolkien did it. But yeah, everything nowadays is very character based first and foremost, right? And we have two different distinct space trilogy or space series that, just because of a simple switch of what we're going to focus on, we've gotten very different stories from.
Yeah, I like that. Hailey, what do you think?
Just as far as going back as far as like how to improve my craft and what I'm doing.
No, that's
I'm just making sure. I think that the most important thing is to foster curiosity. And like that's the thing that we all have innately as kids, because Seth, when you were talking about like, there might be a gnome in that tree stump. When I was a kid, I fully believed fairies existed. Like I read enough fairy tales and stories, and like Fablehaven came out when I was a kid, that I was like, for sure, fairies are real. And if I just do the right things and I go out into the woods behind my house, like I will meet one. And, to some extent that never goes away, right? Like I'm hiking in the woods and I see something cool, and you still see those little things where you're like, wow, this mushroom formation is really cool. Or that tree is, split in just the perfect way that there could be something there. But also just finding things to be curious about in day-to-day life. When we see those articles that are about this ancient sarcophagus that's been buried for 2,000 years and we're going to open it, and we're like, no, don't open it. Don't open it.
Don't do that. This is not the year.
Yeah, exactly. But what would happen if we did open it?
Right.
And so I think constantly looking for those kinds of things is really important. Yes.
That's what happens.
I don't read ancient Egyptian, so I'm not at risk for that. But I think that like kind of having eyes open for those kinds of things is important. And then I have tried to be more critical in my consumption of media, because I am the kind of person who will sit down and watch a movie and just absorb into it to the point where I don't even think, like I don't guess about what's going to happen next. I just watch, and trying to pay more attention to what's popular and why, what works, what doesn't work, what gets me excited when I'm watching a movie versus things that I think are not working. And so trying to be more analytical has been really useful for me. So.
Have you found that it's been a hard transition, or has it been
Yes.
something that you enjoy?
It's easier to do in books because they move slower. And so,
Sure.
and now that I'm a writer, I'm published. And so when I'm reading, often it's research reading.
Right.
And so it's a lot easier to break those storylines down and look at different world elements and think, this thing about the magic doesn't actually make sense. Am I okay with that? Because sometimes I am, and other times I'm not, because there's that level of suspension of disbelief. You have to decide where you fall on the scale. But with TV and movies, still, I'm like a little kid. I zombie out. I stare at the screen. And I'm not great at picking out the elements that I like. So I'm trying to be more conscious of that.
What do you think, James?
So just a whole lot of things. No, that stuff is fascinating. So me and my son, when we're ever wandering around outside, he is currently 5, and but he will be older later.
As they do. I have a 4-year-old.
It
so
keeps happening. I keep trying to squeeze him smaller, but it doesn't work, and apparently I could go to jail. But I take
Plausible
him out
deniability,
and-
James.
Come on.
So what we do is when we ever go out and we're like walking around in like the forest or something, we'll take like little twigs and we'll start snapping them all into like equal sizes. We'll make little fairy houses. And I've always just kind of liked the idea of somebody just finding that and going, what's this doing here? You know what I mean? It's just like one of those like sort of fairly implausible acts of creation that someone may not fully understand and just kind of goes, maybe fairies are real. You know what I mean? Like it's like, just why would someone do that? I always kind of find that interesting. I have a tendency to be probably overly analytical in my approach to there's a lot of decompression that I do when I watch something. Like I just got done with Arcane Season 2. It was a very dense masterpiece, I think. And as I am now watching, like, I've got to be like I'm probably more hours into analysis videos on that than I am like content in the show, because I just really like to dive into stuff and I like to understand it fully, but I also get frustrated when people tell me things like A Series of Unfortunate Events, the children's series, is incredibly good at telling you nothing. And like I think that to me, the thing that I find funny is my joy in the show in these things comes from not knowing, and the term that we sort of use for it is wonder, and I think wonder is a very major motivator for me. Like the Watcher in the Water in Lord of the Rings is like an example I always bring up. A nameless thing that gnaws at the roots of the mountains, possibly disturbed by the Balrog. Is he under Sauron's thumb? We don't know. Seeking the ring, possibly. Like we don't know a lot, but forever locked in my mind is the Flipping Weta Workshop guy describing it. I just wanted this giant sphincter to open up. And it definitely was a sphincter. But other than the sphincter, I don't know a lot about the Watcher in the Water. And I really liked that concept of these nameless things that gnaw at the roots of the mountain. And I like to imagine myself exploring that place and kind of thinking like, oh, what would it be like down there in the inky depths, you know, some sort of combination of like claustrophobia and thalassophobia at the same time. You know, it's like, and to me, it's like, I think about, oh, what made me think that? There's this comedian, Bill Bailey, and he claimed that he writes jokes by going, hoo-hoo-hoo. What would it take to create that kind of mirth? And like, that's almost like how I world build to some degree. Is I go, wow, that's a really scary thought. I bet that'd be really interesting to write about, you know, like, or to be there. And so like that's a lot of like my approach, and ignorance is my favorite thing with it. It's just I like to not know, and I hate being told, but I'll never stop searching until I find it. So like I'm you know, knee deep into wikis and lore pages, reading about like Warhammer, and like not wanting, like, I've never played Warhammer. I just really liked the lore. I've never even read one of the books. Like I have no, I am more into wiki than I am anything with flipping Warhammer. But I like the fact that, you know, there's lots of mystery in that universe that never gets fully explained.
It's really interesting to me that there's such a variety in ways to enjoy world building, in ways to enjoy the product of world building. in ways to continue the exploration even after, an author or a filmmaker is finished with their product. They're not going to add anything more to it. You can still immerse yourself in a world. You can still spend a tremendous amount of time, really quality time, thinking and pondering these questions. And there can be something that's really good for your soul in these worlds of imagination. So I just think it's fantastic that world building has such a wide breadth, and there's something for everybody. Whether it's just sort of the momentary quick hit of, okay, I read the book, I liked the book, I had a moment of enjoyment, now I'm on to the next thing. Or if it's, man, I read this and I would love to live in this world, and so now I'm going to consume all kinds of media, games or other books, whatever it is, to be there. Or even I want to be here so much that I'm going to write my own stories in this world. I'm going to go out and cosplay as people from this world. There are all of these levels of interaction, and there are all of these different ways of enjoying world building, and I just think that's awesome.
I think
really cool.
Part of it is the discovery piece of it, because we talk about world building like, oh, I'm creating this world, but it's not creation a lot of the time. It feels more like you're discovering it. You start with this little seed, and then you say, what if? And it just kind of blossoms from there. But most of the time when I'm coming up with something that's really freaking cool, it's not something that I feel I have created. It's something that I like has inchwormed its way into my brain. And I'm like, ooh, I just found this thing that's awesome, and I can't wait to share it, which is really like childlike and kind of goes back to that, that concept of wonder, I think.
Well, and it's to that point, right? It's like role-playing games are great for this, right? Because it's all about everybody at the table helping to build the story. And that is the end goal, right? Is crunchy or soft. You talked about earlier about lit RPG being crunchy or soft, but like RPG in general is crunchy or soft. And me as a DM, I tend to play a little bit on the softer side because I lean into rule of cool. While I keep the dice in there and I keep the numbers going, there's also things like Delta Green where you're like, yeah, this is really more about how sadistic can we be to the players, and then things like that. But each RPG has its kind of lane, its idea of building something out. And then honestly, the Worlds Asunder crew has probably heard me tell this story before, and some other people have, but the reason I got into writing in general was because I started DMing a brand new world, not based on anything. I used D&D. I stole some rules from the Game of Thrones RPG, a couple rules from the Dresden Files RPG, and I threw together this kind of amalgamation of a game based on an IP that I had come up with when I was 16. And that caught the eye of my now co-author, Casey Azell, and she goes, hey, you did really well with this, just coming up with stuff as we went. I was like, you guys came up with stuff, right? I furthered it. I gave you an open sandbox. I told you what I built, and I let you find the edges and then continue. But that's where, like, to me, if you want to see like the purest form of world building, is when you get a table with groups of players around and you do that. But then that same co-author and I, to finish our book, we went back in time and watched LA Confidential, and we went, what if, right? We were kind of stuck. I was stuck a bit on the ending, and I went, it's not good enough. It's not what we need. It's not how we want to build this world out. And she goes, let's watch something that's in the flavor, and then what if?
I love the idea of yes and as a way to drive something forward. But I definitely resonate with that. I have to say, Dresden Files RPG is one of my favorite games of all time. the
You need to live closer so I have somebody to play it with.
It's true. I'm here for that.
It's such a fun game. The and one of the things that's so fascinating about Dresden's world is it is the epitome of yes and. You know, Dresden's constantly going, wait, you can do that? Wait, that exists? Yes, and it's bigger than you think, right? It's always bigger than you think. There's always more to it. There's always somebody waiting behind, you know, in the wings or behind the curtain that's more dangerous, that's more evil, right? And so it's this constant pull deeper and deeper and deeper into the secrets of the world, because it is yes and yeah, that's I have to agree. I've been writing for a while now. I've written a couple books, and the and probably my favorite part of world building is the collaborative aspect of interacting with readers, and them going, oh, what if this is true? And me going, well, now it is.
What if? Yeah.
Right? Which is exactly how I DM. All my players go, hey, maybe this is true. Sure. And right? And it's so I absolutely love and resonate with that idea of yes and, of getting people together and letting multiple people engage together to create something, because what comes out is always better than what I can just come up with on my own. So that's another thing I love about world building, the collaborative aspect. I'm making a list, by the way.
There's always more to it.
Yeah. Sorry, Hailey, go for it.
Oh, no, sorry.
I thought you were ramping up.
I absolutely could, which is why I'm here, right? The current series that I'm releasing is actually, it's in somebody else's IP. So it's a good friend of mine who writes an urban fantasy series. He's got 5 books. And he said, I want to expand this. It's heavily folklore based. And he said, go pick another pantheon of gods, or, you know, go find a folklore that you love and tell me how they're impacting the same world. And so his is heavily Celtic folklore, and mine, I went into Slavic mythology. And so I've been able to dig into a lot of different, like, old Russian fairy tales and, you know, Eastern European myths, and it gets real dark and real weird. But it's been great. And it's funny because you might look and say, oh, there's 5 books in this series. It's all told, like, that's it. But there's always, like, if you start poking holes in any given, you know, story that you've written or a game that you're playing, you can always find something that you can go, oh, wow, and start, like, pulling at new threads.
Yeah.
That's the Milesian Accords by John R. Osborne. And John has been a guest on Worlds Asunder for us, too. So.
Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. Definitely check that out. That's really cool. Yeah, one of the things that, like, and this is where sort of even this idea of core concept that I like about this is that there is flexibility, but in using sort of a more anchored concept or theme, you can create a bit of a walled garden to play in. So I've experimented. We really like this idea of relating gardening to world building, and I think there's more than 2, but there are 2 major gardening philosophies, right? You have, like, the French garden, which is pure, solid, pointed, geometric lines. I will bend this into my will. And then there's an English garden, which is overflowing flower pots, and it's like there's chaos in that garden. It's the Weasley's garden, right?
Yes.
And that is almost the way that, like, in Seth's description of this, there is this creation of a world in which others are collaborating and others are joining in, and they're sort of blooming in that place. That yes and philosophy, that expansion, that allowing the room. And I think it's a fascinating thing. Like, when I'm creating with players, I feel like my first goal when I'm running a session is to help them understand directionally where I'm going. And then to kind of be like, as long as you're roughly pulling in this direction, like, I am not going to stop you. You know what I mean? Like, if you say, I know this character, and I'm like, oh, cool, what are they? And it's like, you know, it's my latest adventure is a traveler. It's a traveler campaign, Mongoose Traveler, and it became Cozy. I didn't realize I was making Cozy, but I based Planet they're on from on Cornwall, where I grew up. And so all the characters have Cornish accents, and then it became lots of cups of tea and local customs and traditions and occasional gunfights. And that was kind of, but that vibe, within that walled garden, there was a lot of room to play. You know, there's a lot of room. But I think one of the things that Seth and I had discussed speaking about that was this notion of boundaries, like setting sort of the finer limitations on what you're creating. Because, yeah, Dresden's going to be, I know very little about Dresden, but there is a vibe. There is there's going to be some sort, like, it's not just going to be absolutely anything goes. We're not going straight Willy Wonka. Like, you've got a kind of, there's a theme, a thematic element to it. And I think that's really sort of the tension that really exists between a lot of what we're talking about. Because it's yes and then, you know, the alternate no but, like, you know, on the other side of it, that I think is kind of a useful tension to include in that. Because I agree with everything you're saying, but kind of wonder what your thoughts are on your bounding conditions. Do you guys tend to find that you set those limitations either in TTRPG, you guys do, or in your writing?
So we've mentioned Dresden enough that I think it's worth noting. So Jim Butcher, the author, has a couple different series, and I'm still waiting to see where Cinder Spires goes. But the other two that he has, right? He sets limits, but then he finds a way to bust them, right? And he finds a world building way to bust them. And he did it in Dresden Files, and he did it in
Codex Alera.
Yes, Codex Alera. I was like, The Fears of Calderon is the first book. It's Codex Alera. And I had actually, it was funny because I didn't read Dresden first. I read Codex Alera first when it came to Jim Butcher. But he does a really good job of finding ways to ramp up the tension every book. But he also, you know, in the style of progressive lit in his urban fantasy, does power progression. And that's kind of where I learned myself how to set bounds and limitations. Is to leave the what if, you know, the yes and piece somewhere. Doesn't have to be obvious, right? It doesn't have to be explained at the time, just as long as in, you know, and that's kind of the piece, referring back to the quote I made from Futurama earlier. There's a lot of world building, and I've on our podcast for Worlds Asunder, you know, we've put up this the iceberg meme, and it's like there's the very tip of it, right? That's what the reader sees or what the visitant sees, and then there's everything underneath the ocean, and it's all the extra stuff that you did, whether you're a DM, even as a player, as a visitor, like you're doing all of this underneath. And then, you know, if you're reading books and you're doing that, or watching TV series or watching movies and you're just a fan, you're doing all of that, but you're doing it in a way that you're trying to predict what comes next. The author is doing it so they already know, or to some degree have an idea of what comes next. And that's that to me, like, that's the kind of bounds that I use, is can I make sure that I have a way to explain it, even if I never put it out in the world.
So you're in a sense creating that internal consistency, both for yourself, but also for a reader who's going to subconsciously pick up on the fact that, okay, all of the pieces here fit absolutely inside this space.
So right now I said I was DMing a D&D table. A bunch of friends of mine we all game together. But we all live all across the country. So I'm running Curse of Strahd on Roll20 right now. And with Discord picking up the ability to run Roll20 on it, it's been even better. Like, it makes it easy to share. So like some of the guys from the same Discord channel that we're all in, who also game with us, they may not want to play, but they come and listen to the story. And Curse of Strahd is such an excellent horror gothic story.
Yeah.
But being able to take it and twist it just a little bit, so that way it's not the exact same one. Because I have one player who's a very experienced D&D player, and everybody else is new. So I know most of the new guys, they're not going to know.
Mm-hmm.
So I twist it sometimes in ways that helps them out, so that way they don't just consistently die over and over. But at the same time, they have surprised me with how they approach it, because a D&D player who's experienced is going to approach that story very different than somebody who's brand new. And it's resulted in some great consequences, but also some great like stories. So
yeah, Hailey, do you have any thoughts?
I think that boundaries are ridiculously important in fiction and in world building. And I think that that's a base concept, and it's important for your visitants. I love that word, by the way. To be aware of at least some of them. And then the art comes in, and you get to decide when and where to break the boundaries that you've set. And when, like, no, if I break this particular boundary, I will enrage people to the point where I have, failed in my job.
Plausibility.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
So trying to decide which rules are meant to be broken, and which ones are like strategically set up to look like a boundary, and then you use it as, a plot device later on. And I think those things often can be planned in advance, but it kind of goes back to the discovery aspect, where you get into a story and you're like, oh, I know that this is a rule, but I think there's a crack in, the foundation here that I could go exploit, and this could be super cool. And like following those kinds of trails, and then just doing so in a way that it's still believable, so that even if you are, breaking what was a core concept a book ago or 2 books ago or however long, does so in a way that is still plausible. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shady was talking about burying the yes and. So it's not immediately visible, and it looks like there isn't one. And I love that idea of a crack in a boundary that will allow you to expand out into a bigger boundary while maintaining all of the things you've built, so that you're not losing the work you've done. You're not having to restart. One of the tricky things that Lit RPG ran into, and Isekai and Portal Fantasies ran into before Lit RPG, is this idea that when you go to a new place, you have to explain the rules again. And so if you have any sort of world hopping, you're constantly having to re-explain the rules, right? But then you move over to cultivation stories, which, come out of Asia, and what they do is they say, okay, we start with a village, and then you cultivate to a bigger place. You go to the sect, or to a town, and then you go to the sect, and then from the sect you go to the nation, and then from the nation you go to the continent, from the continent you go to multiple continents, the planet, and then from the planet you go out into space into other planets, and then you go to dimensions, and so they have this ever graduated, this expanding universe where they're doing that very thing of saying, okay, I have boundaries, but there's a crack in the boundary, and the hero is going to walk through it.
Yeah.
And they're going to find themselves in a new, expanded version of the same place. It's the same world. It's just gotten bigger. And I think that is really a fascinating technique. Yeah, it could probably be applied to a lot.
Yeah, Attack on Titan crushed that.
I just finished reading the 3rd book of the Cradle series by Will White. I just recently picked those up, and that's exactly exactly what he does. He says the highest progression anyone ever reaches is Jade, and then at the end he learns that there's an entire section of the universe where gold is like the minimum they expect people to reach, which is beyond the wildest dreams of anyone where he grew up, and then it just keeps getting bigger from there. So
he does a great job of, at the very beginning, planting, and this is a technique of cultivation stories. So they didn't originate with Will, but he has a really good technique where he plants a power level that is so outside the scope of what he then explains the character knows, that you immediately go, oh, this kid is in for a wild time, because you as the visitant know what the power scale actually is, what people can actually do. And then you're seeing this kid who's like, no, people can only do X, Y, or Z. Nobody can go beyond that. But you know, as the reader, okay, I know where he's going. I know the trajectory he's on, right? In a sense, it's sort of that idea of, in a TTRPG that James was talking about, where you give people a direction, where you say, this is sort of what we're doing and where we're going. And as long as everything is pulling in that direction, we're good, right? Yeah. And so in Cradle, Will does a good job of anchoring that so that no matter how weird things get, you still know where you're headed, right? Actually, Bryce O'Connor in Iron Prince, I think, does a really good job of that too, because his tagline, man, now I'm forgetting what the main character's name is, but it's so-and-so is going to become a god, he just doesn't know it yet. And so it just immediately sets the scope of what we're talking, like of what the story is. And so the visitant can watch everything unfolding, and they know where we're going. They know where the story is headed. And I think that's just a super underrated technique.
Step 1, manage expectations.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Expectations. So where can we find your stuff, Hailey, for future?
Yeah, I'm Hailey. I publish under H.Y. Gregor. At the time of this recording, I am 2 of 3 books into releasing an urban fantasy trilogy. You can find me at hygregor.com, hygregor on Instagram, Facebook. I am theoretically on Twitter and Blue Sky. The theoretical is strong. So.
I'm theoretically on Twitter as well.
Yeah.
I occasionally go on there and just comment on people's animal pictures and then leave.
That is more than I do, so props.
Yeah. I like round animals. But anyway, Shady, how about you?
I'm so Shady David Shadoin. It's both a moniker and a descriptor. You can find me at davidshadoin.com, which you can essentially find my Facebook, my Instagram, all my social media handles. You can also find Hailey and I weekly on Tuesdays, the Book Career Network podcast. It's the Book Career Network, which hosts 5, anywhere between 3 and 7 podcasts. And we are Worlds Asunder on Tuesdays right now. Until Nick Thacker fires us, we'll see what happens. But yeah, and then you can find me on Amazon if you want to look up my work. Mostly it's short stories. I have 1 novel out called Companion to Ghosts. Hailey and I have a couple things out and a couple things coming up this year, which we'll release. The next thing that we're doing, Next thing that we're doing is a short story, but there's a couple of novellas in the works in Malaysian Accords. I've got a whole set of novels that I owe to John for Malaysian as well. But yeah.
Thank you guys so much for having us. This is great.
Absolutely. Thanks for
gosh.
Thanks for sitting with us and chatting.
Treat.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. I wish I'd brought my whiskey. My whiskey had been poured into a whole bunch of dried fruit in order to make a disgusting English food that I eat every Christmas time. And so I have this very syrupy, viscous whiskey that was poured off the top of that. That is, I tried drinking it. It is just like drinking a raisin.
Was it currants?
But not like wine. Like it wasn't like good. So yeah, like it was craisins and raisins and like diced up bits of dried cherry, which you would think would be good, but I'd left it in there for several days before I poured it all off. So
This
it
is
was
what I've been
unpleasant.
drinking.
Ooh, Oban. It's nice. I had a friend who named his cat Oban out in honor of the whiskey. It's a good name.
Well, if you can see, Shady's a great collector. Everything up here, those are all
Yeah.
bottles that he's collected over the years. So
Nice. Oh, well, this one I used a cheap Canadian whiskey for it.
Yeah,
It's
that's
like a
what it's
blended
for.
Canadian whiskey.
Yeah.
I had found, like for mince pies, basically, that I make every Christmas time, and I will give one to Seth later because apparently
Please.
he likes them.
And last time you
All right.
didn't.
I know. Well, I didn't think you'd like it. Most Americans do not care for it for reasons that I completely empathize with. But that'll about do it for this episode of the WorldCraft Club. We really covered tons of ground on this. Where inspiration comes from in world building, where some of these ideas originate. We talked about gardening. We talked about a lot. I think a real theme for this, honestly, was like a lot of tension. You know, it's like there was like, not that there was like tension in the recording, but more just like there are these competing ideas. You know, you've got the sense of bounding conditions, but you also have the fact that you can break them. You've got this notion of kind of sharing content with your readers and having them sort of expand it and build upon it within the themes that you've established. I think that's incredibly useful, and I hope you guys get a lot out of it. So for myself, James, Shady, Hailey, and Seth, this has been another episode of the WorldCraft Club. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye.
thank you.
And recover from the 20 chicken nuggets that did terrible things to me last night.
You haven't explained that story yet.
Yeah.
I like the idea of leaving everyone in suspense.
There you go.
Like, what
It's
did
wonder.
the nuggets do to him?
That's right.
This is an object lesson.
Cockroaches and,
And,
nuggets. There's the
That's-
title.
We'll leave it hanging out there.